Good afternoon. My name is Greg Bertelsen, and I'm CEO of the Climate Leadership Council, and welcome to today's webinar. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our organization, the Climate Leadership Council is an organization that supports bipartisan climate solutions that leverage the power of the markets to drive innovation and lower emissions. In February of this year, we launched a new Center for Climate and Trade in order to explore, develop, and promote trade policies that seek to lower global emissions, enhance U.S. competitiveness, strengthen our geopolitical standing, and find new opportunities for cooperation with our allies. We are absolutely delighted to have Senator Kevin Cramer from North Dakota joining us here today. Earlier this year, Senator Cramer and Senator Chris Coons of Delaware sent a letter to President Biden calling for the administration to bolster our trade relationships in order to promote cleaner manufacturing and energy production globally in order to reduce Russian influence and the use of Russian energy. Similarly, in December of last year, General H.R. McMaster joined Senator Cramer on an op-ed calling for a transatlantic partnership with the EU to again lower global emissions, increase energy security, and reduce Russia's coercive influence over Europe. Today, the Senator and I will be discussing this marriage of climate and trade policies. Now, I want to just briefly outline how we're going to run today's show. So I'm going to introduce the Senator in just a moment. We'll have a conversation about his work in this emerging policy arena. There will be an opportunity for audience questions. So if at any point you have a question, just click the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as we can. But without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome Senator Cramer to this conversation. Senator Cramer has a distinguished career in public service. In 2013, he became North Dakota's at-large member of the United States House of Representatives. He served 3 terms before being elected to the Senate in 2018, where he serves on several committees, including of relevance for today's conversation, the Armed Services Committee and the Environment and Public Works Committee. Senator Cramer, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Greg, thank you for the opportunity. And I loved listening to your opening description of why your organization exists. And I went, yes, 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 yes. So I think we can have a fruitful discussion.
Well, I agree. And I know there's a lot that we agree on. So let's dive right in. So, Senator, you're from an energy producing state. It may come as a surprise to folks who have been paying less attention that you've been exploring this climate and trade arena. I wonder if you could share with our audience today, what is it about this approach that intrigues you? And then sort of a secondary question, to the extent you've had conversations with some of your Republican colleagues, what's the response been from this approach?
Sure. No, it's interesting because you're right. Not only do I come from an energy producing state, I mean, we are a fossil mega producer, but we're also a clean energy producer in the form of particularly wind energy. And my background prior to coming to Congress was as a rate regulator and a siting regulator on the North Dakota Public Service Commission, where we had very broad authority over siting everything from wind farms and transmission lines, pipelines, obviously setting price for utilities, transmission lines, any energy conversion facility, including even refineries. So, I bring a pretty broad view of a lot of this stuff, but I think that what really is at the heart of my interest in pursuing the possibility of some type of a geopolitical tool is, Otto von Bismarck, the namesake of our capital city in North Dakota, Bismarck, who coined the phrase, politics is the art of the possible. And, we so oftentimes pick our tribe, or we go to our corners and we dig in and we say, hell no, we won't go. And at the end of that, when all or nothing is your beginning negotiating position, you usually end up with nothing if it's still your negotiating position at the end. So I'm looking for possibilities here. And it just seems to me that for too long, we in the United States have not valued our energy transformation, our energy successes, our emissions successes over the years and the decades, even though we're a large energy producing country. And rather than using that as leverage to not only for geopolitical gain, or not only to engage in more trade opportunities and export more of our cleaner produced energy of all types, but also to reduce greenhouse gas emissions throughout the world. It's a global issue. Warming is a global issue, and therefore we ought to put it in the context of global emissions and not just sort of unilaterally disarm, which is what the left has largely wanted us to do, is unilaterally disarm. And I was just looking for some sort of a sweet spot, and then of course begin discussions with my colleagues. You asked the question, how are my Republican colleagues responding to this? A lot of them with some skepticism, but a lot of them with different degrees of agreement. I'm not the first person to talk about a carbon adjustment, or at least in the form of a carbon price or some sort of a carbon tax. And I have Republicans that support varying degrees of those things. I just happen to believe, both in my heart as a matter of good policy, that a price is not necessary, a tax is not necessary, but there's room for a tariff that recognizes a standard that is based on improvement, not based on the worst common denominator, the lowest common denominator. And but I also believe that it's an increment that I think some of my friends in the Democratic Party can support. And that's what really led to the Chris Coons letter with me to the president. He was so intrigued by the H.R. McMaster op-ed last December that you talked about, that he said, hey, well, let's try something. And this is something that looks like it might have the most support. So it's really a combination of practical politics and in my view, good policy.
Well, it seems to me, and I've heard you speak about this issue obviously before, a lot of what we're talking about is a new strategy for addressing global climate change, which is increasing investment in the United States as a way to decarbonize. But I want to stay on the Republican side of the aisle for a second, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the bipartisan conversations. We noted with interest that President Trump's chief trade negotiator, Robert Lighthizer, has come out in support of this kind of approach. I'm wondering if you've had the chance to talk with him at all.
I have, Greg, actually, but interestingly, not prior to penning the op-ed that ran last December that you referenced. I should have thought of that, frankly, because Bob, has been in this space for a long time. But when I contacted Ambassador Lighthizer about this concept, he told me he wrote an op-ed in 1998 that almost mirrored the one that H.R. McMaster and I wrote. And so I asked him to send it to me. And so, of course, he sent a crude, copy, not digital copy to me that we eventually found a cleaner copy of. And I was fascinated by just how on point he was back in 1998. And of course, Bob, being a masterful trade negotiator, understands, and of course, having a strong commitment to an America First negotiating position, he understands geopolitics very well and positioning very well. So yeah, when he and I had what was really a wonderful, delightful conversation, and I've had some since, I think Bob is a very important both consultant, if you will, somebody I can lean on, but also an important face for this type of a discussion, at least among Republicans. I just talked to Bob yesterday and, thanked him for his thoughtfulness. And Bob is somebody who, remember, he's really, in many respects, he and Donald Trump have brought the Republican Party more to this position that I'm describing than we were 5 or 6 years ago. And while it wasn't based on a border adjustment mechanism or greenhouse gas emissions, more based on America First trade, he certainly obviously recognizes that there are standards. And by the way, he applies, and I think appropriately, standards like human rights standards, labor standards, as well as environmental standards. When he wrote that piece in 1994, it wasn't so much about greenhouse gas emissions as it was about more traditional pollution, but recognizing that we have standards that are better than a lot of our trading partners and our trading competitors, and they ought to count for something in the global marketplace.
Well, and those standards, along with the investments that U.S. companies have made have led to our economy on average being more carbon efficient than most of the rest of the world. And so we've already talked a lot about the potential role that cleaner U.S. energy can have in the global economy, but that too, I would assume you view as extending to other industries that so too are more carbon efficient. So I'm curious if you've got any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really important point, Greg, because obviously the lifespan, if you will, of any product, it includes, of course, the production of the product, whether it's a manufactured product, cement, steel, paper, that are heavy on energy just in the production. And then, of course, there's the transportation and all of those things that all have a carbon footprint. And I think when you measure the carbon or the intensity of a product through its life cycle, even if you have a small incremental advantage or a lower carbon increment in any one part of the value chain, when you add the entire value chain to a manufactured product, you really find that it gets better and better the more of that value chain that you apply to the formula. So yeah, I think that if you focus on those energy intensive products as well as the energy itself, and you focus on trading partners that like European trading partners that already meet those standards or exceed them, perhaps in some cases, you've already got a pretty impressive global block or a trading block market. A block that's positioned to leverage not only to the benefit of the investment in the United States and investment in other clean producing countries, but to incentivize further cleanup by polluting nations that would rather find it more advantageous to clean up their act, if you will, rather than pay a tariff or a penalty for it.
That's right. And so what we're talking about here is creating the right signals to send investments in manufacturing where we're doing it the cleanest, which
precisely
in many cases means the United States, but then also creating an incentive for everybody globally to continue to improve their performance. But I want to kind of zoom in on something that you just said, and this came up in a number of the things that you've written and things that you've said around this sort of international cooperation opportunity. In your, in your op-ed in December, you talked about a partnership between the EU and the United States, but then you projected forward and said, this could perhaps extend to the entire G7 and beyond, and sort of the block that represents over half of the global economy. I'm curious if you've had the opportunity to have any conversations with representatives from other countries, or do you have any sense of what their reception to your work has been?
Yeah, great point. Actually, I have. So sticking with the European Union for a moment, obviously one of the things, and by the way, I didn't anticipate this necessarily when I first started thinking about this, and it wasn't even a reality in last December when we published the op-ed. But with what's going on right now in Ukraine and European nations who have been ahead of us on the idea of a carbon adjustment, obviously a border adjustment mechanism, they were still pretty well tied to Russian energy, and so the opportunity to create to isolate Vladimir Putin and Russia more, that's a national security issue that gets rolled into this as well. But since the invasion, several European nations, energy ministers, even Kadri Simons from the European Union, the European Union's Commissioner of Energy, have been in to visit with me about this concept. Now, again, they're a little bit further down the road. I want to be in concert with them, not have to catch up to them if we can, but that all, remains to be seen. But beyond that, other leaders have been in as well. And because I'm on the Armed Services Committee as much as anything, I end up visiting with ministers of defense from places like Australia. Today, the Prime Minister of New Zealand was here, and I had lunch with her and 9 of my colleagues. Taiwan, I've been over to the embassy here and met with the Taiwanese ambassador, I'm going to call her that, and talk about these same opportunities. I just think when you're talking to allies that are dealing with adversaries that are common to us, and they have a strong commitment, of course, to emissions reductions, I think there's a lot of opportunity, and you're exactly right. Remember, the G7 too that's really the birthplace, if you will, of the Carbon Club, and I see this as a Carbon Club type of opportunity as much as anything. It also, I think, is an appropriate place to have the discussions about, how does this affect WTO policy? Does a price matter? All of those things. So I don't think there's any question. There's a lot of opportunity here, geopolitical opportunity that has as its goals, good investment and economic opportunity, greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and national security.
Well, and in calling for the potential for cooperation with the G7 on this, actually just last week, the G7 released a communique in which they, in fact, said that they were going to pursue some form of a carbon club. So perhaps they're reading what you're putting out. But it's an encouraging development from our standpoint. Why don't we just turn to the audience now for a question, if that's all right? So
sure.
You actually just mentioned WTO. I'm curious how much you're thinking about WTO compatibility, whether now is the right time in this exploration to be concerned about that. Have you given it much thought? Curious just to have you comment a little bit more.
Well, yeah, thanks, Greg. I have given it thought because, of course, some people think it's a concern. And if somebody thinks it's a concern, it's a concern. And I happen to believe that it is not a problem. We've talked to enough people that I'm comfortable that a carbon price is not required or shouldn't be required to, for us to pursue a very even-handed carbon border adjustment mechanism. Even-handed is obviously an important standard when you're talking about trade policy, when you're talking about WTO and third parties. I think there may be some, that disagree. I'm sure there are, but I'm comfortable that we can move forward with discussions at the very least, and hopefully with some incremental conclusion that's helpful, that doesn't include a domestic carbon price.
Well, and I would add that this is a policy that's grounded in seeking to reduce global greenhouse gas
That's
emissions.
right.
We've done some analysis around what things would look like, just illustrative if there was this sort of carbon club among the G7 countries. And what we found is if imports match the carbon intensity of those countries, we'd lower global emissions by about 2 billion tons. I mean, that's a substantial amount of emission reduction. So I think it's important for folks to remember, who are concerned about WTO or thinking about WTO, that when a policy is first and foremost for environmental reasons, you're on pretty strong.
That really important point, Greg. I mean, you hit it right on the head. And remembering, and I'm going to go back to this occasionally, there's also a war going on in Europe where, 6 months ago, the standard was very different than it is today in terms of, let me just say, the need and the demand. And what's happened is, because our European partners need our help so much. I mean, they need it not just with weapon systems and good intelligence. They need our products, particularly in the energy sector. The bridge, if you will, to a completely, non-emitting energy is, still being built. And the good news is that if they replace American or other, cleaner natural gas produced in a cleaner way, shipped in a cleaner way, they see immediate reductions that they wouldn't see if Nord Stream 2 was still bringing a dirty Russian gas to Europe, for example. So I think you're exactly right. This is the platform, this is the opportunity that presents itself to a lot of people who haven't traditionally thought about these things.
Well, that's exactly right. And so I think that's an important point to make. So, there's a lot of talk about border carbon adjustments, but when you expand what you're proposing here to that sort of carbon club concept, what we're talking about is American manufacturers, American energy workers being part of the global climate solution, right? We're saying more investment, more production, more manufacturing in the United States, exported to the rest of the world as a strategy for lowering global greenhouse gas emissions.
That's right. And you know what else what's interesting, it shouldn't be surprising, but I mentioned earlier that Ambassador Lighthizer talked about other factors like labor standards and human rights standards. Well, I have this little thing I call a patriot premium, or I've sort of shifted that a little more to a freedom premium. These also happen to be, not surprisingly, but importantly, by and large, allies who have the same values across the board as we do. Not all identical, obviously, but gosh, we really have a great opportunity to promote our values beyond just, climate values among our allies. One thing that Vladimir Putin has done is he has demonstrated not only to Europe, but to the entire world, what happens when one of us is threatened, and the solidarity that has come from that among the West, and as well as other leaders. Like I said, just today, meeting or having a little pre-lunch lunch with the New Zealand Prime Minister was a great example that he's unifying a world around these values. And I think that's just a perfect scenario to share other values, including all kinds of freedoms, as well as greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, taking it a little bit closer to home and staying with the theme of unity, one arena where we're lacking some unity perhaps is in the chamber with which you work, but we have all been reading with interest the early conversations that you've been a part of as part of this energy and climate bipartisan conversation. If the reports are correct, you perhaps have a meeting later today to discuss some of these concepts. I'm curious if you're willing to share how are those conversations going broadly, and then sort of more specifically within the stuff that we're talking about, whether it's a CBAM or a border carbon adjustment, how has that policy been received in the early conversation?
So interesting, Greg. The CBAM is always sort of on the edge, or just on the periphery of our discussions, because so far what we focused on is what are the policies, and a lot of them dealing with the tax code, dealing with some sort of a menu, if you will, of tax credits, clean energy credits, or the electric vehicle credits, or whatever you might call. There's all kinds of them. There's a long list of them. They're all part of the Build Back Better plan, and trying to sort of find out where are the top 4, 5, 6 that have the greatest bang for the buck that we can agree on. My sense of that part of the discussion is that it's a pretty small group of acceptable and affordable credits, but it's could be meaningful nonetheless. So we've sort of hung out there. That's sort of where we're focusing. Is offshore wind a higher priority? 45Q for carbon capture, utilization, and storage a higher priority? Should it just be fuel neutral? Which is something that Ron Wyden, as you know, has been promoting, more of a fuel neutral clean energy credit that focuses on reducing emissions, which I rather like, frankly. I do think when you start picking the fuels and having different incentives depending on the fuel, you get yourself sort of in trouble, right? But it's all built on finding common ground, or at least finding what you're willing to give and what you're willing to take. And I think at the end of the day that there's a funnel that that gets it down to a pretty finite number. But the idea of a carbon border adjustment mechanism is brought up at every meeting, oftentimes by Senator Manchin himself. But then you start having the discussions. Okay, what does it look like? Is there a price? Is it domestic? Is it solely, what Chris Coons and Kevin Cramer wrote about to the White House? And so I think if there's going to be an agreement among this group, that in all likelihood it will be some form of a carbon border adjustment. And frankly, if it's something that goes further than what I'm talking about, it's going to become problematic for most Republicans. With regard to the likelihood of even getting to something, I don't know, but I know this much: that Joe Manchin, who I call our prime minister, if as long as Joe Manchin's willing to stay in this fight, lead these discussions with optimism and hope, I want to stay in it with them. You can't walk away from the table and get anything done.
Well, thank you to you and the other senators for holding some space for some bipartisanship. So I want to turn now to a couple of questions from the audience, both related to how other countries might react in this climate and trade arena. So you can take them in either order.
Sure.
The first is, how concerned are you once this type of a framework is set up that a country may cheat to seek to sort of avoid the fee at the border?
Sure.
Folks sometimes refer to this as sort of the China cheats concern.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second question is, how concerned are you that the European Union will move ahead with their CBAM policy, sort of ahead of the United States in a way that might be detrimental to U.S. interests?
Yeah, both really important points. The questions and points, right? So on the latter one, I do worry about that. And every time a European leader comes in, I do sort of plead with them, help us catch up, if you will. Let's reconcile something together before you move forward too quickly. It may not, but it may, very possibly become problematic for us if they would go too far ahead of us without a reconciled solution. The first, of course, I answered the second part first, and I forgot what the first part was, but it was important. What was
the first question was if a country cheats and seeks.
Oh, yeah. So for sure, you need some sort of a third-party verification. I don't know what that is exactly, but it does have to be pretty well, obviously well defined, and be able to be well enforced. Otherwise, you almost certainly will have that. Again, I don't know what it'll look like exactly, but we need some sort of a third-party verification process.
So we are approaching our next election in November. Obviously, primaries are already taking place.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious how the reception has been back home for the kinds of things that you're trying to achieve through this climate and trade agenda. How's the response been with your constituents?
Everything from what the hell is he talking about to, oh my God, we lost him, to, that doesn't sound like the dumbest idea in the world. So the key to it, Greg, is exactly what you and I are doing right now. And I do a lot of this, and that is talk to my constituents, talk to the stakeholders, present the reality of the situation. There is such a grand opportunity, again, presented to us in many respects by Vladimir Putin. The opportunity was always there, but it's really there now. There's also a political opportunity because we have on the right Donald Trump and the Bob Lighthizer that have been talking about America First for a long time. We have evidence that America First is actually advantageous to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the marketplace. Let's leverage that. And then you have a European continent who, by the way, has been really difficult to do trade with. They've never liked our food policy. They've been more protective. They've been more geared toward organic agriculture and not sort of the mass production that we do. And so we have found it very difficult to do business with them. But now there's a crisis, and crisis often brings people together, and it forces us all to focus on the reality and what's doable in the moment. And so when I explain this back home, when I answer the questions and I take them all on, people they're pretty intrigued by it. And I think as long as they see they're not going to get hurt by it, in fact, that there's grand opportunity for our competitiveness, they largely get on board, or at least they don't tell me I'm nuts anymore.
Well, I think that's the key. That is, and I think you've done a great job of explaining that. This is about leveraging a carbon advantage that we already have.
Right.
It's a way of using investment in the United States economy as a way to lower global emissions. Senator, we're very close to the end of our half hour. I want to give you the chance for the final word, and also just thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, my final word would be to thank you and thank CLC and all the other organizations that are in this space with me, that both counsel me, encourage me, hold me accountable when I get too far off the rails, challenge me, and just provide that support. Very, very important. I might also just add one other thing that I've been doing. I've been bringing CEOs of large banks back to North Dakota for a series of events that I call a bully pulpit series, and so people like David Solomon from Goldman Sachs, Brian Moynihan from Bank of America, Jane Fraser from Citi, organizations, large lenders, large investors that have expressed in the form of ESG statements and other things a strong commitment to the transition, and I'm helping them identify opportunities in that transition that include a lot of cleaner traditional energy innovations and technologies that move us forward, and ways that America again can lead and be recognized in their leadership across the globe. So we just have to stay in it and plod along, with conviction, a cheerful demeanor, and good intellectual honesty, and I think we'll be fine.
Well, we thank you for that approach, and we thank you, Senator Cramer, for joining us today. To our audience, thank you so much for tuning in. Please keep your eyes out for future events, and I want to wish everyone a wonderful afternoon. Thank you again.
Thank you.